Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So what is it that makes some people become quote-unquote preppers and others not, or even to the point where they're repulsed by the idea? So let's get to it. Alright, so I've tried to unpack the mental heuristic that a person undergoes in their transformation into becoming a person who would self-describe to be a prepper or a survivalist. Now, I've broken it into 5 critical areas, but I wanted to build this brick by brick from the perspective of somebody who at once was the furthest thing from a prepper to somebody who has become the Canadian prepper. Which is not to say that I think that I'm the most prepared Canadian, not at all, not even remotely close. But let's get to this. So there's 5 general stages, coincidentally, that I think a person mentally must traverse in order to get to the place where we would call prepperdom. Now, I should say before I get into this that this is about full-blown preparedness here. This is about somebody who's preparing for 6 months and up. It's not about somebody who just goes out and buys, a small storage of food or a pre-made Bugout kit offline, tucks it in their closet. I'm not referring to those people. They're probably a much larger percentage of those people than we think, because that's a practice which is considered quite socially acceptable, if not socially responsible. But I'm talking about a real, fully fledged prepper. But I'm not talking about the wild-eyed, paranoid, the end is coming very soon type prepper, which I'm going to talk about towards the end of this video. Now, the first stage of this process of becoming a prepper is going to be the acknowledgement that something can, in fact, happen. Believe it or not, there's a lot of people who probably do not think that bad things can happen because they haven't happened to them in their lives, particularly more so as we live in more highly domesticated, structured environments where we're protected from the rigors of the real world. There hasn't been any major wars in several decades. You could count the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War, a lot of these proxy wars going on. But I'm talking about major wars which have warranted conscription and where you've had multiple countries getting involved, and that there was a back-end Cold War going on at the same time. Now, a lot of people who don't think anything could happen, usually simple exposure to media which shows them things that could in fact happen, especially if it's from an official mainstream source. That's why you're seeing a lot of people being turned on to preparedness by the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA talking about the importance of being prepared, because more often than not, these are people who are very conformist, not very independently minded people, at least not in the sense of their views and values being at odds with the views and values of the prevailing government or culture as a whole. So simply having discussions with these people about the inherent vulnerabilities of the system is usually enough to get them thinking that, things could happen. And that's prerequisite to anything else, because if you don't think anything could happen, you're not going to go much further in this evolution of ideas. Now, the next stage is going to be an acknowledgement that there's perhaps more probability of something happen than you originally thought. So after you acknowledge that something could happen, you need to also acknowledge that there's a high probability that something will happen, because that usually just knowing that something could happen is not enough to really compel people to make preparedness a part of their lifestyle, because you could say a comet could come and hit the planet, but you never know when that's going to happen, and thus most people are not going to be motivated to prepare for such a low probability scenario. So there needs to be some sense of imminence that something is going to happen within your lifetime. That could be something like a weather event, which is highly localized, or it could be something regional, national, or global in scope. So in trying to convince somebody, if that's your MO, I'm not necessarily trying to convince everybody, but I'm just trying to explain, what my thought process was and what I think a lot of other people's thought process is going to be in accepting this stuff. So you're going to want to walk through the various reasons why there is perhaps a higher probability of things happening than people think. So a lot of people will reference the fact that, we've gone a long time without any major event. For example, it's been 3/4 of a century since there's been a major world war. It's been almost 100 years since there's been a pandemic. We're almost 100 years away from the last major agricultural crisis, which was the Dust Bowl, or, even the Great Depression of the 1930s. A lot of these things are far removed from people's memories, and so therefore they don't have a real-world experience reference point, but they also just presume that it's never going to happen again. A simple technique you can employ if a person is resistant to high probability of events is ask them, what is different in our modern day economy, if you're talking about financial collapse, from the one that was present in the Great Depression? Well, simply put, there's nothing different. They still have the Federal Reserve. It's still generally the same economic system as it was back then. The only difference is that now there's a situation as such that the world on the whole has an estimated $180 trillion debt, if you were to add the debt up of all the countries in the world. And of course, all the manufacturing's been outsourced, and artificial intelligence and self-driving, self-guiding technologies are quickly putting people out of work. So not only is there a high probability of hard economic times ahead, it is absolutely certain that it will happen. It's just a matter of when. Once a person understands that something will happen, and it's just a matter of when, that's when they've nearly completed the second stage of their evolution into becoming an emergency preparedness individual. They might also say things like, yeah, well, now we have the United Nations, and therefore countries have signed agreements to not go to war, and you have the G20, NATO, a lot of these different allied countries, which would ensure that war would never happen. But then you might ask them, well, why is it then that since the creation of the United Nations, we've basically still been in a perpetual state of proxy war? So what's to say that that is not going to escalate at some point to a hot war on a global scale? Or if they don't believe that the increasing superstorm cells, or the major blizzards, or the heat waves, or the droughts, if they don't think that that's going to happen, that's pretty easy to point to factual reasons why they should acknowledge that one and take those more localized meteorological threats more seriously. You can point to epidemiologists who are talking about impending pandemics. So that's how you might influence a person to see these things as being more probable. Now, as a bridge into the next stage, a person needs to understand that the government views the greater good as trumping the needs of the individual. And thus, the information that you get may not be accurate information. So a person needs to have a healthy distrust or skepticism towards the government and mainstream media. Take, for instance, a I Am Legend scenario where there's a viral outbreak on Manhattan Island, and the military doesn't really tell people what's going on. They just, take out the bridges so that people can't escape. So they're trying to do what's right for the greater good, but it comes at the cost of you probably dying within that quarantine zone. So that's just one example of how the needs of the greater good will be put before yours, and how you might even be fed disinformation or misinformation to immobilize you or negatively impact your ability to keep yourself safe. So people who are very conformist and very trusting of government, they need to overcome this mental hurdle. Now, that itself is not enough, because number 3 is something which permeates number 1 and 2. It's something which is always kind of there. And it's this tacit understanding that the system is, quote unquote, too big to fail. There's a lot of faith in technology, in the legal process, in the political process. And I think that a lot of this has to do from the fact that many people nowadays are very far removed and alienated from the critical infrastructure that basically keeps them alive. So not many people know where their heat and natural gas comes from. Not many people understand how the power grid works. That, it would only take the compromising of a few major power lines that are, pumping in power from hydroelectric plants or whatnot to compromise a significant part of the grid, or to blow out some transformers or whatever. They overestimate the resilience of a system because they don't actually know how the system works. And they just presume that smart people will fix it, or that, the government is competent enough, if there ever was a disaster, that they have the logistical plans and the resources to take care of everybody. So they don't see the government ineptitude in dealing with crisis situations which are even just on a small regional scale. Never mind something which is statewide or nationwide or, heaven forbid, global. Because clearly anything over the regional level, the government is not going to be able to respond and make sure everybody's taken care of in an expedient way. This is evidenced in the proverbial Hurricane Katrina, that government response times are typically low, and it's not always because they're incompetent, it's just because there was no plan of action to deal with it in the first place. Now, this is where political persuasion is going to be either a barrier to getting the person to move on to the next step, or it may actually assist them in getting to the next step. If you're talking to a person who's of the conservative mindset, who is already quite skeptical of government, and not to say that liberals can't be skeptical of government, don't get me wrong, but generally speaking, conservatives want less government, so they're probably going to be more likely then by default to think that governments are incompetent in dealing with these things, as opposed to a liberal person who might still have more faith in the government. And those are the people that are going to struggle to move on to the next step, because they firmly believe that there's a bunch of nerds that are going to fix everything, and that the system is simply too big to fail. If they can make it to the next level, which is the personal vulnerability versus personal responsibility level, you might get some people who are, and I was in this bracket, for a short period of time, where I thought to myself, well, if something that big happened, I wouldn't want to survive anyways. So you get people who may take a fatalistic attitude here, or what might happen, which might prevent them from moving on to preparedness, is that they would take the attitude that, well, I'll just rise to the occasion. That even if the government fails, even if you've gotten them to acknowledge that the government may not come to your assistance, that they are just going to somehow rise to the occasion and deal with it themselves. And so this is where you would get into having a discussion about, what would you do if this scenario? And that's how you get them to identify the holes in their capabilities, which of course may compel them, which is level 5, which is finally acknowledging that you are incapable of surviving one of these scenarios, and that you need to work on your skills and resources and general preparations should these things come to pass. That's when you become a prepper. Now, to me, that's a healthy evolution of thought. I think that that's an evolution that you would want to see somebody go through to become a prepper. And there's some people who are never going to get past any of those stages until something happens to them. Now, conversely, you also have the person who is mentally unwell in their preparedness. Now, even though I say they're mentally unwell, I still think it's good that you're prepping, even if you are prepping for the imminent end of the world as we know it, because so-and-so on their YouTube channel said that it was going to end at this exact date. Even then, I give people props for prepping, even though perhaps it's motivated for the wrong reasons. So if we were to take these people and see what their thought process of becoming a prepper was like, it's basically going to be the same as the former, only they're going to have fast track through it with rapid speed. So they're people who not only believe it could happen, they believe that it will happen. And throughout the second stage, even more specifically, they're probably, thinking near term. They probably think it's imminent. They may even have a date in mind. They believe that not only is the government inept at helping people, but they also believe there's malfeasant agendas within it, and that they're actually going to try to, manipulate and push excessive rule of law or martial law on people. So not only is the government not going to help you, they're actually going to try to hinder your efforts at sustaining your own life. Now, in terms of stage 4, these people have a obsession with staying alive. Now, instead of feeling that, life isn't worth living in those conditions, or that they're going to rise to the occasion, they have a very high, possibly even morbid desire to live. Even though, ironically, they might not be living their lives, whatever that really means anyways. I know that's very subjective from a philosophical standpoint. What does it mean to, quote-unquote, live a life? But they may not be living their lives to the current social standard or what it means to have a life, while at the same time having this extreme desire to survive at all costs for whatever reasons they might have. And it's paired with a lot of insecurity about what may come and a lot of fear about what may come. So these people almost have too much fear, whereas the former, the optimistic person who may never transcend the level of fully becoming a prepper, they're too overly optimistic. This individual may be overly pessimistic, overly fearful of their fellow human being. They may believe that human nature is inherently evil, which, for the record, is one of the main differences between conservatives and liberals. By and large, a conservative acknowledges that man is an animal and that man is selfish, and that as such you should be concerned about preserving yourself because you cannot trust people. Whereas liberals take a more optimistic view of human nature, all you need is love type thing, and that at the core people are positive. So therefore a lot of liberals never start prepping because they don't see the inherent evils in different people in the world. And so they're kind of oblivious to those threats ever materializing in a grid down scenario until, of course, crap gets real and they get their house broken into or they get jumped or something like that. Then their perspective starts to change. So the paranoid prepper underestimates their capability to rise to the occasion. And they try to overcompensate for that anywhere possible by storing excessive amounts of food, by making life choices which remove themselves and their families from the grid. And I'm not just talking about, moving on to an acreage or, a homestead or something like that. I'm talking about the extremist retreat as far as you can into the woods like people. And I really don't think there's a lot of people like this. It is a spectrum, you could say. And as I said before, there's a few factors that determine which person you're going to be. What are your political leanings? Were you raised in a rural environment where self-sustainability was just part of being alive and you don't even know what a prepper is because that's what you've been your entire life, like the fish doesn't know what's in water? Maybe you're more independently minded than a person who is very extroverted and partaking in society on every level. And also socioeconomics can have a role here. So I think a lot of preppers and survivalists are people from a lower socioeconomic bracket, which is not to say that there's not a lot of wealthy people out there and learned people who have degrees, who have really good careers, high paying jobs. There's a lot of well-off preppers out there, don't get me wrong, but I think by and large a significant majority of people who in particular have disdain for the government, are like the working man types who maybe are lower on the socioeconomic totem pole. And again, having a cynical or overly naively optimistic view of the world is going to shape which camp you fall into as well. So you can temper both of these extremes, like the over-the-top super prepper and the person who never thinks anything is going to happen, by simply asking these people questions that are going to force them to come to the conclusions that you are already aware of, but that they need to hear themselves say. So in the case of the person who believes nothing could happen, they need to say it in their own words that something could happen, that there's a high probability that it will, that there's a good chance that help is not coming, and that they're going to have to rely on their own capabilities before they're actually going to accept that they need to make emergency preparedness a part of their lives now more than ever, arguably, in history, as we fully descend into the age of consequences. Let me know what you think in the comments section. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Canadian Prepper out. The best way to support this YouTube channel is to support yourself by gearing up through CanadianPreparedness.com or BugoutRoll.ca. Premium quality gear at the best possible price using the incredibly secure and easy to use Shopify platform. We offer free shipping to the United States for orders over $200 USD and free shipping to Canada over $75. So support the channel by supporting yourself.